time. So, Vashna, the floor is yours, please.
Great, thanks. Thank you all for coming. I think for me, yeah, I mean, Pindela was right about my interest in Pan-Africanism, which actually developed, I think, out of my own work around trying to change the curriculum at the university and beginning to think about the issues around knowledge and how it's produced, where it's produced, and who are seen to be the producers of knowledge. And generally in the world, especially within the academic world, the people who are seen to be the producers of knowledge tend to be seen to be European or from the United States, from the global north. And often we are just here as a sort of bank, a research bank, for people to come and do research on us and then take that and think about it using theorists from the global north. And rather than producing theory from here, thinking about our condition. And so I decided to start looking at particular individuals who are famous and some who are not famous, and trying to think of them as intellectuals and trying to think about the intellectual production and work that they do. Because often if you think about an African leader or an African intellectual, the idea is that they are always producing in retaliation to something, like in a moment of politics, as if they can't be purely intellectual. So if you look at someone like Kwame Nkrumah, who was a philosopher, an analytical philosopher, he's not seen as an analytical philosopher. He's seen as a nationalist and as a politician. And so I began to really start rethinking this kind of stuff, and got really interested in questions around Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism has had quite a bad rap for itself in the last, I would say, 20 years or so. And a lot has to do with it kind of descending into very nationalist forms of politics, and a lot of it has to do with the sort of identity politics that gets infused within it. And that is not what the Pan-Africanist movement for most of the 20th century was about. So what I'm going to do today, in today's lecture, is give you a sort of brief history of the development of Pan-Africanism, the different strands within it, and the organizational aspects of Pan-Africanism. And then tomorrow we're going to be looking at slavery. So then we're going to start looking at actual thinkers that we put into this sort of Parthenon of thinkers, and we're going to look at Frederick Douglass, who was a key individual. There are other individuals I'll talk to, but I gave you all the text around Frederick Douglass to read. So he'll be the key individual, but I'll speak around that. And then I'm going to speak about Pan-Africanism and feminism, and that I think is really important because that's something that gets really sidelined and marginalized in the discussions around feminism. And what's interesting when I was putting this program together was to try and think about how was I going to put someone like Sojourner Truth, who was a woman who was enslaved, but who was also one of the key members of the feminist movement. How was I going to treat her? Where would I have her? So even though I've put her into the feminist section, because of the way people overlap and ideas and identity, it's difficult. It's so I'm still grappling with these sort of the ways in which I've defined things. And then we'll obviously go on to the last section, which is around Pan-Africanism, colonialism, anti-colonialism, post-colonialism, and nationalism. So yeah, that's like a brief sort of thing. So today will really basically be an introductory lectures into some of the ideas that come out of it and some of the key figures within the movement of Pan-Africanism. Now, with the history of Pan-Africanism, you have a very early sort of, the first thing that comes up is the question of how do we define Pan-Africanism, okay? And then, recently there's this huge uproar in the media because Meryl Streep said something, or supposedly said something like, we are all Africans, so, what does it matter if the awards aren't as representative of everyone, right? So, and then if you're speaking strictly in terms of scientific DNA stuff, then yes, people say, well, we all come from the continent. So what does it mean to be African? At a very basic level, we need to have that discussion when you want to think about what does Pan-Africanism mean. Now, that term evolves and means different things to different people. For some people, it'll say, well, we all come from the continent, so, therefore we're all African, so we all should be accessing this. It's kind of like that's the kind of response to Black Lives Matters when people say all lives matter, because it's actually disingenuous. It's not taking into consideration the reason for Pan-Africanism, which is really about, as Lewis Gordon would say, it speaks to questions of politics and oppression. Okay? So it's about ideas of politics and oppression, and that mainly deal with what we call the underside or the subaltern classes of history. Okay, so there's that idea of what Pan-Africanism is about. That's what it starts with, and then there's several strands within Pan-Africanism. There's the religious strand, there's the intellectual strand, there's the socialist strand, there's the nationalist strand, and then more recently, which actually was running all the way through but has come to the fore in the last few years, is a sort of idea around notion of identity, something like identity politics being tied to questions of African identity, of Pan-Africanism. So these are the various sorts of ideas around Pan-Africanism. Now, religion has played a key part in Pan-Africanism, and in fact, it's the earliest formations of Pan-Africanism, which don't actually come from the continent. They come from the enslaved peoples who go to North America and the Caribbean. So the idea actually develops outside of the continent, right? It comes from people who, so the early formations are people who are trying to really, in the sort of oppressive conditions of slavery, develop some notion of identity that recalls their home. And it's a very syncretic form of identity that evolves. It's found in things like voodoo rituals. It's found in various formations of churches and so on. It's people trying to keep some link with the continent. And this is very important because the condition of slavery, we have to understand, was made and built on the fact that they wanted to separate people and deracinate people, take people away from any semblance of normality and humanity. So, you know, you would never get the same people from the same area on the same slave plantation, because the idea was that would foment revolt. This was especially true in the United States. You didn't get the same people, they would purposefully not have families together. The entire slave system was based on the fact that you could not reproduce, all right? So the early forms of slavery meant that people could not be in love, they could not form partnerships, they could not reproduce, they could not have children. This was because at that time the Atlantic slave trade was still functioning, so the idea was, you know, we'll just keep on bringing them from the continent. So people weren't allowed to express their humanity, and religion and various sorts of religious and traditional practices then was a way for people to assert this. So this was the earlier part, and religion continues to play a very key part within Pan-Africanism throughout, right up until, you know, recently. And it's not just Christianity. I mean, you have the early key people within the Pan-Africanist movements from very early on who were thinking through this, like the ex-slaves, someone like Booker T. Washington, someone like W.E.B. Du Bois. Well, he wasn't he was socialist, but someone like Frederick Douglass. They were deeply Christian in their beliefs. Someone like Sojourner Truth was deeply Christian. On the continent, someone like Saul Plaatje, Dube, all of them were deeply Christian. They were influenced by this, and that's what their Pan-Africanism was central to, was religion and their religious practices. And then as we find what happens in the 1960s is a rethinking of African American conditions, and then you have a figure like Malcolm X, who's incredibly important to black movements and to Pan-Africanism of the 1950s and 60s. And in that sense, Islam was incredibly important. And I think it's very important for us to think about Islam because we really underplay its role on the continent. And because in South Africa, we are so South African centric and we forget that the rest of the continent is there, we continuously, when we talk about religious influences on the continent, we talk about Christianity. We often leave out the role of Islam. And if you bring in the role of Islam, because if you think about the continent much more broadly and think about the changes historically, if you bring in something like Islam, you get a very different reading of the continent, a very different reading that is different to what the colonizers give you. And so it's not just about a question of you thinking about religion so we can say, oh, well, there's different religions, but it's a way of methodology so we can rethink how to write our history to get different answers. Because once you start looking at the history of Islam on the continent, you realize that fallacy that's continuously been told to us, that this was an oral-based society, the continent, people on the continent was oral-based, you begin to realize that this is not the case, because there was huge libraries all across North Africa. Within Islam, one of the key forms of key parts of worship is writing. It's literate. So there were lots of people on the continent that were literate in pre-colonial era. And this even and there's also lots of evidence of this that predates even the coming of Islam to the continent. So you get a very different reading if you start thinking about religion in this way and then its role within Pan-Africanism. And then what we have is another way in which religion also plays a key part within the organization is coming from the Caribbean largely, is around the notion of Ethiopia, right? And the fact, it's in the Bible where they say, I will read it because I don't know my Bible very well. It says, Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth into hands unto God. Right? And so it's this prophecy, this idea that you would be freed through this moment. And we know how important Ethiopia becomes to, say, the Rastafari movements, which are also very Pan-Africanist, and it's at the heart of this idea. And Haile Selassie comes to be seen as this redeemer of hope. So Ethiopia, in a religious sense, becomes incredibly important within this. And it's kind of a movement that really revitalizes people's thinking around the continent. And that's the place that they go to. That's the idea of what they want, the return to that land. But Ethiopia, as we'll see in the story, also becomes later very important, especially around the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italians. And then we'll see how that brings a lot of people together again in another Pan-Africanist moment. So you then have another strand which is really important, is the intellectual strand of Pan-Africanism. Now, the intellectual strand was always there from the very beginning, and we also have to think then about how do we define intellectuality. Were the religious leaders not intellectual? Well, I would argue that they were intellectual, right? But this is purely in the sort of academic sense of intellectual. And it's very important in this sense. You have people like C.L.R. James, who you've had the readings from. He was a key intellectual, and a key intellectual of Pan-Africanism, and a key communist intellectual. And also you have someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, who many argue is the father of modern-day sociology. And then you have someone like George Padmore. So you have a variety of these intellectuals who are working, and those are the early people who are working in it. And then it goes up. You have someone like Walter Rodney, who's another key intellectual, and today you have someone like Lewis Gordon, who is one of the most important Pan-African intellectuals and philosophers around. And I think, what the sort of intellectual work that Pan-Africanism tries to do is, and I'll just quote this from Lewis Gordon, which I think it's incredibly important. He says, they try and create an area of thought that focuses on theoretical questions raised by struggles over ideas in African cultures and their hybrid creolized forms in Europe, North America, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. Afrikaner thought, Pan-African thought, also refers to a set of questions raised by the historical project of conquest and the colonization that emerged since 1942 and the subsequent struggle for emancipation that continues to this day. So that's how it's come to be read by very modern day scholars like Lewis Gordon and so on. And I think for someone like C.L.R. James, it was incredibly important that he starts rethinking history. And one of the key texts that he writes in this, one of his key contributions to this Pan-African project was a book called The Black Jacobins. And it was the writing of the Haitian Revolution. Now, how many of you have heard about the Haitian Revolution? Okay, how many of you studied it at school? How many of you studied the French Revolution at school? Okay, exactly, right? So this was the point of what C.L.R. James was trying to do. He was trying to really get people to think about the history of the world. One of the key things that we are continuously told on this continent is that we need to modernize, that we need to catch up with the rest of the world, that we are backward, that we are on the outside of modernity. Now, what we mean by modernity is not, I don't know, skyscrapers or something, but what we mean by modernity is the process of making things into this now contemporary world. And someone like James, he was the first person to begin to argue that actually the continent of Africa is at the heart of building modernity. It's not on the side, it's not an attachment, and it's not backwards, it's not catching up. It is central to building modernity, because slavery is what enables the building of modern cities. It's what enables the building of the modern capitalist system. And he says, and those slaves were instrumental in that building. So even though they did not have the power within that, they were instrumental in building it. So the continent then gets, you re-look at our continent, not as people who are, in deficit. You look at us as having to build and being part of building. So he, in trying to rethink this project, he writes the history of the Haitian Revolution. It was the first time the history of the Haitian Revolution was ever written about. Okay? And in fact, he talks about how the French archive had actually removed references to the revolution from its archive, so that it doesn't have to tell the story of the first successful slave revolt, and that it happens in Haiti. Now, James is really interested in this Haitian moment, and so is someone else, former President Thabo Mbeki. They're both incredibly interested in this moment of the Haitian Revolution because they see it as the moment that the modern world gets built into. The lines that are drawn in the Haitian Revolution around class, around race, around gender, and so on, and whose history gets told, they say was made at that moment. Okay? So he writes the story, and it's in a response to a lot of things, and a lot of those things are actually happening right now. And it's so sad. This book was written and published in the 1930s, but today, right now, all the issues that are happening at university, all the questions around curriculum, all the issues about what we study, this started with people like James and them who are questioning this and asking the very same questions that our students are asking today that is not getting answered and has not changed. Okay? And it's these questions about why is it that we still have such an untransformed or colonial, I would say a colonial syllabus. Okay? Why has even our education not been decolonized? Right? And one of the key reasons for this is I think that what went hand in hand with imperialism and colonialism was this vast project of education. Okay? And we have to take that very seriously. Like we take very seriously the role of religion and missionaries in the colonizing project, we have to take very seriously education. And at the heart of this notion of European civilization was the fact that they had all this education and all these ideas and philosophy and science, as if they just magically sprung up from their heads and no one else on this whole earth until then. So there's this question that's at the heart of this intellectual aspect of the Pan-African project, is how to undo that. How to undo European chauvinism that parades as universalism. Because it's actually not universal. It's actually Eurocentric, and it parades as universal. And then when you want to bring in other voices, when you want to say, let's speak about Anna Julia Cooper, let's speak about C.L.R. James, let's speak about Saul Plaatje, then you are told that you are being nationalist, that you are not actually taking seriously the universal project. As if all these thinkers, someone like Locke, just arose out of nothing. So at a university, people are fully willing to teach Locke as if Locke was an individual without context. They don't teach the fact that Locke was a slave-owning individual. That's left out of that. But we have to appreciate Locke's philosophy. But when it comes to dealing with African thinkers, and you say, let's teach Nkrumah, oh, but you can't because he's a nationalist. Right? So we're going to take their context seriously, but you don't take the context of this European Enlightenment project seriously. Okay? And at the heart of this idea is this thing that comes from George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who's a key German philosopher of the late European Enlightenment period. Hegel argues the following. He says, at this point, we leave Africa, not to mention it again. for it is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Historical movements in it, that is in its northern part, belong to the Asiatic or European world. Egypt will be considered in reference to passages of the human mind from its eastern and western phase, but it does not belong to the African spirit. What we properly understand by Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still involved in the conditions of mere nature, and which had to be presented here only as on the threshold of world history. So this idea is so powerful, and it's at the heart of our academic project even till today. Okay? And that's the reason why, if you want to teach these Pan-African intellectuals at university, you come under a huge amount of pressure. You are not supposed to be teaching these ideas because they are not properly intellectual. Okay? And it's in defense of this position, because this position was not without anything. This position was made so that you can defend the sort of superiority of the global north, the superiority of Europe. And that's why it was made. And so challenging this and challenging these ideas means that you are challenging the very heart of the claims of the empire and of the imperial powers in the world. Okay? And that's why the fights are so strong. And that's why it's so painful. People don't want to give it up. There's always this question, like everyone who's outside the academy always asks me, but you know, all these people, like they have PhDs and they're so bright, why are they holding on to these ideas so much? Why have they not transformed? Why is it that the university that you work at, currently called Rhodes University, still so untransformed, has about 28 black in general academic staff? Why is that? They should be the first ones, if we have to believe this idea that knowledge is something that liberates you. They should be the first ones to be changing this. But when at that heart of that project of knowledge is a built-in notion of superiority of one group of people, if you take that away, then they don't have anything to base that on. It goes to the heart of what it means to be European, those claims they've made for about 300 years about what makes them superior to us. And so that is why it's such a struggle, and that is why it takes so long, and that is why, for example, our philosophy departments are the most untransformed spaces in this country, literally. And why no black people go and do philosophy. They leave it. They actually leave it. I'm very interested in theory and philosophy and ideas, but I do it in history because it's such an unwelcoming discipline in this country. And it speaks directly to those questions. And so someone like C.L.R. James wrote this amazing book. It had huge consequences, but all outside the academy. Had huge consequences politically. It was never taught at universities. The Black Jacobins, for the first time in South Africa, was probably taught about 10 years ago by 2 or 3 individuals. Okay? The same way, Fanon, which has huge impact and consequences on people's lives, on race studies, on all sorts of things, was also not taught at university. He wasn't considered to be a proper intellectual. Okay? So these individuals that are really, really important in shaping and getting us to think about questions of race, questions of class, questions of empire, and questions of knowledge have been left out of our curriculum. All right? And it's really interesting. It's fine it's left out in Europe because they have a different set of questions to deal with. But why is it being left out of our curriculum and our knowledge when these are exactly the questions we need to be dealing with? Okay? So I think these kinds of, what happens with James and them is that they want us to really begin to see the complexity and develop a new conceptual framework for us to think about our lives and the world in which we inhabit. And it's in this rereading of history through this contemporary framework. That's what they want to do. And so what you have is, you have really radical ideas developing out of this. Radical ideas that also, the key thing these days is interdisciplinary work. We work in interdisciplinary manners. But these thinkers were doing interdisciplinary work from the very beginning. Fanon is one of the key individuals that does interdisciplinary work because he's looking at He's a psychiatrist, but he's looking at psychology, he's looking at notions of the intimate space, and he's trying to make a discussion about politics and race around that. Okay? And so this is what begins to happen. Then what you have is, out of this comes a variety of ideas around how we see ourselves, the psychology of racism, how our continent has been represented by different people. And key within this are individuals who are left out of this. Key intellectuals who are generally also spoken about even less than Du Bois and C.L.R. James and so on. And these are the Pan-African women intellectuals. They are spoken about even less. So the Sojourner Truths, Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper, and so on. They are usually left out of that narrative. Bell Hooks says, you know, when you teach kids, and you ask kids to name black thinkers, they readily have 10 or 15 names. It's the same names, but they have them ready and available to you. But when you ask them to talk about the women, they're very few. Okay? And how many of you have heard about Anna Julia Cooper? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And Ida B. Wells? 1, 2, 3. Right. But I'm sure all of you have heard of Malcolm X. Right. Okay. So this is the kind of questions we need to think about. And what was coming out of these amazing women intellectuals were deep questions about the role of women in society, the oppression of black women in society, as well as the oppression of a class oppression of women. So a lot of these intellectuals had different ideas about class. So that's the other key question that begins to form. So you have Pan-Africanism then beginning to, the thinkers beginning to get really influenced by socialism in the early 1900s, and that comes into really its pinnacle in the 1960s with someone like Kwame Nkrumah, who really kind of espouses what he says is not just socialism is what he wants a scientific socialism. Because he says, and I'll read to you what he says, at the core of the problem is the class struggle. Myths such as African socialism and pragmatic socialism, he says, that implies that there's existence of a brand of socialism that's only applicable to Africans. So once again, you are othering. And he says, no, what we need is a class struggle, and it has to be the class struggle which exists in other parts of the world. Okay? And it has to be an international class struggle. And it's not just Nkrumah, it's people like George Padmore and James and so on. One of the other key Pan-Africanist thinkers, Aimé Césaire, who was also a communist but left the Communist Party, because he says what we need is a communism that's in service of Africans and not Africans in service of communism. But he remained committed to class struggle. So there's that faction that develops. And then on the other side, you get the nationalists developing, and you get the ideas around identity becoming very strong. And this can go back to individuals like Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was, I think it was Jamaican. He was Jamaican born, and he really develops a sort of Pan-Africanism where we have to return to Africa. So it's a politics of return. He's famously said Africa for the Africans. And I'm always very skeptical about politics of return, because that usually means, you know, a return to some form of past that's quite conservative. Usually women have to return to the kitchen. That'll probably be the big first step that happens in those politics of return and these ideas of return. Whenever I see them globally even, it really worries me, because it then, you know, it also can take on incredibly fascist forms like it has in places like India and stuff today. So these politics of return, we want to return to some pre-colonial moment when we were untouched in the past, is very problematic for me. And this is what begins to happen with a lot of that aspects of Pan-Africanism, is this return to this sort of idealized past. And that takes issues of production very seriously, and who's producing and holding capital. So for someone like Marcus Garvey, the idea is that black people need to be the owners and controllers of their own capital. and they need to develop their own money, and they need to have all of this working for them. And that, I think, is really important as well. And so that becomes a key strand. So these ideas are dissecting and they're differing. And then we have what we have from this is we have the sort of what begins to develop then is the organization, the actual structures of Pan-Africanism, okay? And they develop in different ways, and what you see happening is intersecting into this organization, which comes into being in the late part of the 19th century, is all of these ideas. So it's split, it's going in different directions, and there's different people involved, different ideas come to the fore at different periods, and so it's a very sort of fluid notion. So when people talk about Pan-Africanism in a very broad sense, it ends up meaning nothing, because you have to be very specific about the form of Pan-Africanism, okay? So what you have is a sort of the organizational form of Pan-Africanism really comes into being in 1897 when Henry Sylvester Williams develops this idea of this creating a movement where he wants to have a series of conferences. And you have people from all African people from different parts of the world coming to these conferences and discussing the history.
1897.
Yeah, 1897. Okay, and so it was. So you have the first Pan-African Association, right, being formed, and it was a kind of like more of a support committee, more of a coming together to talk about things, because there's really no space for you to talk about it outside, okay, or in your places of work or in your life. So this is what it actually is, the statement of that went out to people who were invited to the conference. It says it's to encourage a feeling of unity, facilitate friendly intercourse among Africans in general, promote and protect the interests of all subjects claiming African descent, wholly or in part, in British colonies and other places, especially in Africa, by circulating accurate information on all subjects affecting their rights and privileges as subjects of the British Empire, and by direct appeals to the imperial and local governments. Okay? So it was about coming together, seeing what people's problems are, and then making appeals, okay, to the imperial state. Now this was the kind of politics that was happening during this period globally, these appeals to the empire. The idea was that lots of people bought the rhetoric. A lot of black people who, around the world, globally, lots of colonized subjects, bought the rhetoric of the colonizer. Colonizer said, look, you know what? We're coming to colonize y'all because you guys just don't have a lot of stuff and y'all are a bit backward, but we will fix all of that. We'll colonize y'all and make your lives terrible, but in that you will learn to become better, right? You'll become Christian firstly, which will just be great for y'all. You will work for us and labor for us and learn the discipline of labor, because you know y'all weren't doing that very well. And you will then also get some education when we decide. Okay? A lot of people, and they said, and then you will become civilized. You will become like us. And once you achieve all of these key things you need to achieve, this checklist, you will then be allowed to be civilized. Right? But we know that was a lie. That was never going to happen. That was never the plan. That was just the idea that was sold to people, right? And it was an idea that they sold to themselves to make them feel better about, you know, just basically exploiting most of the world's populations and sometimes exterminating them, all right? So it was a way for them to say, well, we are here to take care of them. That's sort of paternalism, all right? And we have it a lot still, especially in South Africa, all over the place. So it's like, we will take care of you and we will get you. A lot of people bought into that. They did the work. They got educated. They became Christian. They did all of the things that was expected. They dressed a particular way. They spoke a particular way. Only then to find that they're still not good enough. Only then to find, as Fanon says, when I walk into a room, reason walks out because of the color of my skin. And this is when the sort of difficulties come in. And you know, because initially colonialism has several phases. Initially it was just about plunder. And then once they decide to have forms of settler colonialism, it's this idea that comes out of Macaulay, who writes this in relation to India in the education meeting minutes. He says, we will create a college in India. And they created something called the Calcutta College. He says, we will create colleges in India, and this will educate Indians who will be British in every way except the way they look. and they will then rule in our stead. So they will do the ruling for us. So we'll create this class who will do the ruling for us. That's what mission education was about. That's what all these colleges that they were investing in was about, to create a class of people to do the ruling on their behalf. But what begins to happen is that those same people begin to rebel. That's why in a place like Congo, for example, they don't develop colleges, because they begin to see that the elite, you create this educated elite, and they become the most dangerous people. They become the ones who are questioning you, because you are not accepting of them. So this is what's beginning to happen, is that people, they still think that they can appeal to the empire to see reason. If we behave civilized enough, we will appeal to them. Everyone was doing it. The early formation of the African National Congress, someone like in the Indian Congress like Gandhi, a variety of people, that's the politics of the day, was we'll then appeal to show them how civilized we are. Booker T. Washington was a key individual in trying to promote this. If we become like them, if we do the things that they want, we will become civilized. I mean, we have a version of that in our country today. Someone like Jonathan Jansen with his ideas around, you know, just be a particular way, conform, let's do this work. Then you will be fine, okay? And so this is what happens. Then you have a second Congress is convened in England in 1900 itself. It's between the 23rd and the 25th of July 1900 at the Westminster Town Hall. And this now becomes a much more political statement that's released, okay? And they're really asking that people get their political rights. It's now asking for political rights. They're saying that, you know, we need to have industry, we need to have education, we also need to really sort of develop a whole series of authorized writings and collections about ourselves, generate knowledge about ourselves. So it's much more political than the first one. And the key organizers of this was, along with Henry Sylvester Williams, were people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Alexander Walters, Henry B. Brown, and Anna Julia Cooper, who's often left out of that narrative. People don't even speak about her being there, but she was one of the key organizers and members of this moment. And so it was here, so while they were having this, Garvey creates his own Pan-African separate organization, Marcus Garvey, in 1914. And it's called, it's basically, it's Universal Negro Improvement and Conservation Association and African Community League. Okay, so it's a mouthful. Obviously wasn't in for short, quick names. So he really kind of builds this idea around the fact that people need to gain independent rights, and African people need to have complete control over their institutions, okay? And they need to have complete control over the production and their own capital. And he does things like he builds the first, he owns the first steam lines that take people from North America and bring them back to the continent. And he works on that project of returning people back to the continent and then trying to create this idea that it's going to be only for Africans, okay? So it's a very different understanding of it to people like W.E.B. Du Bois and so on. And then you have this, the third actual Pan-African Congress in 1919 in Paris. And this is very important because Du Bois realizes that when they are having these meetings, there are very few actual Africans from the continent present. And so realizes that they are replicating those those same power relations that the colonizers have in place. So he really calls for a lot more Africans to be present. And once again, you have then questions around exploitation coming to the fore. Right? And one of the other key sort of influences in this moment is Georgist economic theories. Now, Georgist economic theories say that anything that's natural, that can be derived from the land, natural resources and so on, must be held in common. And it's what you produce yourself can you make profit from. right? But everything else that you can't produce yourself, that it's there naturally, should be held in common. So this becomes a very important idea that's coming through this conference, this idea that we have to hold land in trust, in common for people, and so on. And so the questions of education and upliftment. After this conference, you begin to have a split within the Pan-Africanist movement. And this split comes about by some of the Pan-Africanists becoming much more socialist and communist in nature, and others going towards a nationalist route, and much more towards politics of identity rather than to questions of class, and much more about control of capital. So there is a fairly big split. And it's also not unimportant because obviously with the rise of sort of Stalinism within communism globally, there's a split, and some people leave the Communist Party, and therefore they're moving away from these ideas. But someone like C.L.R. James remains very strongly communist. But what happens in 1935 is the invasion of Ethiopia, and with this, people come together again, and they put aside their differences because they say, you know, what you have is a sort of nationalist split saying, well, we have to save Ethiopia because it's Abyssinia, it's the land for us to return to, it's all of these things, and our king is there, and so on. So there's those questions that are built into this, and that's why they want to. Now, someone like C.L.R. James would say, no, we need to free Ethiopia from both the Italians and the emperor, and we need to instill a form of socialism within that country. But for now, what we need to do is get rid of the Italians first. Then we can have those discussions thereafter. So this becomes a huge sort of rallying point. And then you have one of the key, I think the most key meeting of the Pan-Africanists, that's in 1945. And this happens in Manchester. Now, if you notice, they keep on meeting in Europe, the Pan-Africanists.
Is it
1945. Okay, and whenever I teach this, my students keep on saying to me, but why are they meeting in Europe? I'm like, well, that's because that's where most of them were living and were studying. So that's where they were meeting, all right? Now, then that leads to questions. Well, if you are being educated and when people begin to criticize the limits of Pan-Africanism, they say, if you are being educated within a particular framework, and even though you are questioning it, your thinking is still limited about the possibilities of what you can do, because you have been so sensitive, or so sort of assimilated into a particular system, right, in a particular way of being. So your questions and what you can imagine are also limited by that system you've been assimilated into. And that's where some of the key criticisms come in of the Pan-Africanist movement, because people say they're still keeping to the Europeans, they're still keeping to the sites of power within the colonial world. And what begins to happen though at this meeting is there's key Africans that come to the fore of this meeting, and that's Nkrumah and Kenyatta. All right? Now, in those two individuals, you have the split of the general split in Pan-Africanism. Kenyatta is a nationalist and Nkrumah is a socialist. Okay? And so Nkrumah and Kenyatta really bring to the fore very, very political questions, and it's about the emancipation of everyone. And we say to the peoples of the colony that they must fight for these ends by all means at their disposal. Right? So it's now affirming armed insurrection. It's affirming the sort of fight against colonialism. It's no more doing the sort of politics of petitioning, okay, and inducing. It's now a politics of it's our right to have this. No more we will ask you to give it to us. It's like Malcolm X says, if you don't fight for your rights, then it's given to you, it's not given to you fully, right? It's not a proper right, it's not given to you fully. So they begin to bring this in. Then obviously what begins to happen is in 1952, Nkrumah comes into power in Ghana, and Kenyatta comes into power in Kenya, and a variety of individuals who are at this Manchester conference are now leading the new independent post-colonial countries. Okay? And you see that sort of the sort of lines of influence from the Pan-Africanism, and Kenyatta takes a very nationalist root. It's, sort of, and you can see it, Kenyatta is an anthropologist. He studied anthropology. So you can see his ideas of returning to the sort of untouched village life coming from that anthropological perspective, right? Which is also very problematic and quite racist, like anthropology generally is. Sorry, there's anthropologists in the room. But it's generally quite a problematic field of study because it develops to study the other, right? And obviously there's other great anthropologists and people do fantastic stuff, but that was at the heart of it. And Kenyatta wasn't undoing that. He was affirming that otherness of Africans. And Nkrumah obviously takes a much more socialist line within Ghana. So you have this. Then in 1963, now that people are in power, you have the Organization of African Unity coming into being. Now, Nkrumah, being a socialist, internationalist, kept those internationalist ideas alive with his Pan-Africanism in Ghana. I mean, there's lots of things we can criticize about Nkrumah, but he did keep that. C.L.R, James, Du Bois, all of them moved to Ghana. They become, it becomes a central place of thinking internationally about the African condition, about the black condition. Whereas Kenyatta really holds onto those lines of nationalism, right? And it's really interesting because at the moment of independence, we just accept the nationalism that was imposed onto us, the boundaries that were imposed onto us from the Berlin Conference, as if they are solid, like as if we can't unthink those things. And that is one of the key problems that Pan-Africanism then begins to face. Because you want to build an organization that doesn't recognize the differences put in place by the empire, but you accept the empire's lines of boundaries and how the empire has divided you. So it's this deep contradiction within that. And then you have the formation of things like the Organization of African Unity. And I think this is the moment that Pan-Africanism becomes depoliticized, properly depoliticized. Because it becomes this official organization and it's controlled by the elites within each country, okay? And it increasingly becomes nationalist in nature. So there's no more an internationalist aspect of it, okay? And at this conference you have the sort of split again where the elite nationalists are saying, well, we want this nationalist line, we must recognize our borders, we must do all these things, and it's about enrichment. And then the use of identity to legitimate their power. Okay? So they come to use their identity and the ideas of blackness to legitimate themselves, exploiting and appropriating, and we know the problems of the post-colony. All right? Someone like Nkrumah says, no, we have to have socialism at the heart of it. And it gets accepted in a form, but it's a very watered down form, so it's not actually, doesn't really have any actual purchase. Right? And so some people then say that that's one of the key areas, that's one of the main failures, is the lack of, the sort of watering down of the socialist aspects of Pan-Africanism and the taking over of this nationalist elite. And this leads to that form of identity politics. Okay? That form of idea that I'm this person, and because I'm this person, I now deserve certain things, okay? Or this is my experience, right? But there's no form of discussion of the political. How can we now take those things and act on it? How do we build a movement? How do we take on power? How do we do all these series of things? It becomes a very depoliticizing thing. So if I'm just going to wear my little African outfit, then that's fine. But what are you actually doing? What are the politics behind that? So that's what it becomes. It becomes that sort of question. And that's why now it's such an unpopular discussion, because those leaders are so unpopular in the post-colony, right? And so we need to, there's a few things we can do around Pan-Africanism because it can be very useful for us thinking through our issues in society. I mean, there were still later Pan-Africanists, someone like Walter Rodney, who took this question of class incredibly seriously. Someone like Lewis Gordon is obviously just hugely important for our thinking, especially since he's a philosopher. But I think why we need to really examine Pan-Africanism again and its uses is because a lot of the questions that had been asked during this period was asked by, are still the questions people are asking now. It's still the questions young people are asking now at universities. It's still the same issues we are grappling with. And so if we can learn from these examples, we can understand the pitfalls, we can know where not to go moving forward. Okay, so that's just a quick little summary. If we can, yeah, we'll have questions and then we can open it up to that.